They told her she was nothing, a barren queen sitting on a borrowed throne, smiling at a court that wanted her gone. Every minister whispered it, every noble house believed it. And on the night of the imperial banquet, when her own stepmother stormed through those golden doors with a lover on her arm and treason on her tongue, every soul in that hall expected Empress Celine Vale to shatter like glass. They were wrong, dead wrong. Stay with me until the very end of this one. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments so I know where my people are watching from. The chandeliers in the grand hall of Ashenmere burned low that evening, their flames guttering in a draught that no one could trace. 1,200 candles, and still the light felt thin, as though the palace itself knew something foul was crawling through its veins. Servants moved between long tables draped in ivory cloth, pouring wine the color of old blood into crystal that had survived 3 dynasties. The air stank of roasted boar, of jasmine oil rubbed into the necks of women who had spent 4 hours dressing for a meal most of them would barely touch. And beneath it all, that other smell, the one no perfume could smother, power rotting from the inside out. Empress Celine Vale sat at the high table with her spine pressed flat against the carved oak of her chair, her fingers resting on the stem of a goblet she had not raised once. Her face was still, not calm, not serene. Still, the way a lake is still when something enormous is moving just beneath the surface. The silk of her gown, the color of crushed midnight, pooled around her feet. Her dark hair was pinned tight against her skull, not a single strand loose, as though even her appearance was a fortress she refused to leave unguarded. She had not spoken in 20 minutes. Beside her, King Alpha. Darius Valamont leaned back in his throne with his jaw locked and his eyes aimed somewhere above the heads of the nearest courtiers. A big man, broad across the chest, thick through the arms, the kind of frame that looked like it had been built for war and then slowly buried under years of banquet tables and political compromise. His crown sat slightly crooked. He had stopped adjusting it an hour ago. There was a tension in his neck, a vein that throbbed just below his left ear, and he kept flexing his right hand open and closed beneath the table where no one could see. Lord Chancellor Edric Thorne sat 3 seats down, dabbing sweat from his upper lip with a cloth that had already gone dark with moisture. He was watching Celine. He had been watching her all night with the careful, measuring gaze of a man trying to calculate when a beam would break. "She looks composed," murmured Duke Aldrich Montague from across the table, leaning toward Thorne without moving his lips more than necessary. Thorne did not look at him. "She always looks composed. That is precisely what concerns me." "You think she knows?" "I think," Thorne said, folding his damp cloth into a tight square, "that if she does not know tonight, she will know by morning, and I would rather not be sitting this close to the blast when it happens." The banquet had been Darius's idea. A show of imperial unity, he had called it. 3 months of border skirmishes with the northern provinces had left the treasury bleeding and the noble houses restless, and someone in the advisory council had convinced the king that what the empire needed was not soldiers or strategy, but a party. A grand, glittering display of wealth and harmony to remind the provinces that the throne was not wobbling. Celine had argued against it. Quietly, precisely, in that voice she used when she already knew she was right, but understood that proving it would cost more than conceding. Darius had overruled her. He overruled her often these days. She remembered the exact moment it had started. 4 months ago. A sealed letter delivered to Darius in his private study, a letter he had read and then burned without telling her its contents. He had looked at her differently after that. Not with hostility, with distance, as though someone had taken a knife and cut an invisible thread between them, and now he could not quite remember why he had ever tied it in the first place. Celine had said nothing. She had watched. She had counted the days between his silences, catalogued the names of every advisor who entered his chambers after dark, noted the shipments of gold that left the treasury with seals she did not recognize. She had done what she always did when the ground began to shift beneath her feet. She had dug in, lowered her center of gravity, and waited for the earthquake to reveal itself. Now the earthquake was here. She could feel it in the floor. The doors at the far end of the grand hall opened without announcement. No herald, no trumpet. Just the groan of ancient hinges and a gust of cold air that sent the nearest candles flickering sideways. Conversations died in waves, starting at the back of the hall and rolling forward like a tide pulling out before a storm. Lady Merelda Ashworth walked through the doors as though she owned every stone beneath her feet. She was tall, sharp-boned, with a face that had once been beautiful, and was now something harder, something polished by decades of ambition, into a blade that could cut from across a room. Her gown was crimson, an act of aggression disguised as fashion, and it trailed behind her like a wound across the marble floor. Her silver hair was unbound, flowing past her shoulders, and she wore no crown, no circlet, no jewelry at all, except for a single ring on her left hand that caught the candlelight and threw it back like a challenge. On her arm walked a young man, 25, maybe younger, tall, lean, with cheekbones that could have been carved by a sculptor working from spite. His clothes were too fine for his station, whoever he was. Dark velvet, silver thread, boots polished to a mirror shine. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been afraid, which meant he was either very powerful or very stupid. The way his fingers curled possessively around Merelda's elbow suggested the latter. Celine's eyes tracked them from the moment the doors opened. Her expression did not change, not one muscle. But beneath the table, her left hand closed slowly into a fist, her nails pressing half-moons into the meat of her palm. "Who let her in?" Darius said. His voice was low, not quite a whisper, and it carried the particular flatness of a man who already knows the answer is going to make him angry. Lord Commander Voss, standing behind the throne in full ceremonial armor, shifted his weight. "No one stopped her, Your Majesty. She arrived with a letter bearing the royal seal." "I did not issue a seal." "No, sire. But someone did." Darius's jaw tightened. He looked at Celine. She did not look back. Her eyes were on Merelda, and in that gaze was something Darius had never learned to read, something patient and terrible, and absolutely focused. Merelda crossed the hall with the unhurried stride of a woman walking to a throne she believed was already hers. Courtiers parted before her. Some nodded, more than Celine expected. That was useful information. She filed it away the way a general files away the position of enemy cavalry. "Darius!" Merelda's voice rang across the hall, clear and hard as a hammer striking iron. She did not use his title. Every person in the room heard the omission, and every person understood what it meant. "I see you have thrown yourself another feast while the provinces starve. How very like you." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. You could feel it pressing against the walls, squeezing the air from the space between people. Servants froze mid-step. A wine pitcher trembled in a young boy's hands. Darius rose slowly from his throne, and the motion had the mechanical quality of a man who is moving because protocol demands it, but whose mind is still 3 steps behind. "Merelda, you are not invited. I do not need an invitation to walk into the house my husband built. Your husband is dead, and this house belongs to the crown." "The crown?" Merelda smiled, and the smile was a weapon, thin and precise. "Which crown, Darius? The one on your head, or the one your wife pretends she deserves?" The young man on her arm shifted, and for the first time his gaze found Celine. He looked at her the way you look at something you intend to step over. There was no fear in his eyes, no respect, just the flat, appraising look of someone who has already been told how this story ends. Celine met his gaze, held it, and the young man looked away first, though he tried to make it seem casual. Thorne leaned toward Montague again. "This is the play. She is making her move tonight. In front of everyone? That is the point. Witnesses make retreats impossible." Merelda stopped 10 paces from the high table, her crimson gown fanning out behind her. She released the young man's arm and clasped her hands before her, a gesture of mock composure that fooled no one. "I have come to speak plainly," Merelda said, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall, "because plainly is all that is left when an empire is governed by sentiment instead of strength." "You will watch your tongue," Darius said, "or I will have it watched for you. Threats. Always threats from you, boy. Your father would have acted. You just bark." The insult landed, and Darius's face flushed dark from the collar up. Celine saw his hand drift toward the arm of the throne, fingers gripping the carved wood until the knuckles went white. He was angry. Good. Angry men make mistakes, but angry men also make messes, and Celine needed this hall intact. "Say what you came to say," Celine said. Every head in the room turned. It was the first time she had spoken all evening, and her voice cut through the tension with the clean precision of a blade drawn from its sheath. Low, even, without inflection. The voice of a woman who has learned that volume is the weapon of the weak. Merelda's eyes locked onto Celine and something flickered in them. Surprise, maybe. Or the brief, involuntary recognition of a threat that had been underestimated. Celine, Merelda said, testing the name like a coin she suspected was counterfeit. The silent Empress, the queen who sits and smiles while her kingdom crumbles. It has not crumbled yet. You are still standing in it. A murmur rippled through the courtiers. Merelda's lips thinned. For now, Merelda said, but not for much longer. Not if the true daughters of this empire have anything to say about it. She turned to the hall, spreading her arms wide, and the gesture was theatrical in a way that told Celine this speech had been rehearsed, possibly for weeks. Lords and ladies of the Valamont Empire, you know me. You knew my husband, the great Duke Ashworth, who built the northern fortresses with his own hands and bled for this throne before most of you learned to read. I raised 2 daughters in this empire. One was taken from me and given to this king as a bride. She pointed at Celine without looking at her, the way you point at a stain on the wall. The other, my Celestine, was cast aside, forgotten, denied her birthright because a dead king's promise mattered more than merit. That is enough, Darius said. It is not nearly enough. Merelda turned on him, and now the mask was fully gone, and what was underneath was raw and scorching. 3 years. 3 years she has sat beside you, and what has she given this empire? No heir, no alliance, no strength. She is barren, Darius. Barren in body and barren in purpose. And while she sits there in her silence, the empire bleeds. The word hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Barren. It rippled outward, and Celine could see it moving through the faces of the courtiers, could see the way it confirmed something they had already whispered to each other in private. The word was a weapon, and Merelda had chosen it with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly where a woman's armor was thinnest. Celine felt it. She would not pretend otherwise, not to herself. The word landed in her chest like a fist, and for one moment, one single breath, something cracked behind her eyes. But the crack did not reach her face. It stayed inside, in that place where she kept everything that could be used against her, locked in a vault with no key. She breathed, slow, through the nose. Let the air fill her lungs. Let the silence stretch until it became something else, something that belonged to her instead of Merelda. The young man beside Merelda was smiling now, a small, private smile, the kind worn by someone watching a performance they have already been told will succeed. You speak of barrenness, Celine said, and her voice had not changed, not by a single degree. In a hall where half the lords present have buried 3 wives and sired no sons. You speak of purpose. In an empire where your own husband died with debts that took the treasury 2 years to reconcile. You speak of strength. She paused. Let the pause do the work. While you enter my hall on the arm of a boy who is not your husband, not your son, and not your equal. The young man's smile vanished. Merelda's composure cracked just for an instant, a fracture in the ice that sealed over almost before it appeared. You dare! I dare because I am the Empress. And you are a guest who arrived without an invitation to a feast you were not welcome at, accompanied by a stranger whose name you have not offered because you know what offering it would cost you. Merelda's chin lifted. His name is Lord Cassian Drake, and he is the son of— I know who he is. Celine's eyes moved to Cassian, and the flatness in her gaze made him take a half step back before he caught himself. The question is whether the court knows what he is. The hall was rigid now. No one moved. No one breathed loudly. This had gone past spectacle into something else, something with teeth, and every person present could feel the shift. Merelda recovered. She always recovered. That was the thing about women forged in the old courts, where a single misstep could end a bloodline. They could take a blow and keep walking. What he is, Merelda said, is the man who will stand beside my daughter Celestine when she takes her rightful place on this throne. Celestine is not in line for the throne. She should be. She carries the blood of Duke Ashworth, the blood of conquerors, the blood of men who built this empire stone by stone. What blood do you carry, Celine? Your mother was a seamstress from the river towns. Your father married my husband's sister for her dowry and drank himself into a grave before you were 10. You were elevated out of pity, not birthright. Celine did not flinch. But inside the vault, another crack formed. Because this part was true. All of it. Her mother had been a seamstress. Her father had been a drunk. She had been elevated into the Ashworth household as a child when her father died, raised alongside Merelda's daughters, Not as a sister, but as a project, a charity case displayed at court functions to demonstrate the family's generosity. She had slept in the coldest room, eaten last, worn clothes that had already been through two daughters before reaching her. She had learned to be silent, not because silence was a strategy, but because speaking earned her nothing but corrections. And then the old king had seen her at a harvest banquet, had watched her sit motionless through 3 hours of insults from Merelda's eldest daughter without once changing her expression. And he had turned to his son, the young Prince Darius, and said, "That one. That is the one who will not break." She had not broken. Not then. Not since. But the cost of not breaking was a kind of hardness that lived in her bones now, a calcification that made tenderness feel like a foreign language she had once spoken fluently and could no longer remember. Darius was looking at her. She could feel his gaze without turning to meet it, and in that gaze was something she could not afford to examine right now. Doubt. Not doubt in her, doubt in himself, doubt in whether he had the spine for what was about to happen next. "Merelda," Darius said, and his voice had found some of its authority again, though it sounded borrowed. "You have made your point. Now leave this hall before I have you removed." "Remove me, then. Let the Empire see how their king treats the mother of a rightful heir. Let them see his soldiers drag an old woman from a feast while his barren wife sits and watches." "She is not barren." The words came from Darius, and they surprised everyone in the room, including Darius himself. He blinked after saying them, as though he had not planned to speak and was now committed to a position he was not sure he could defend. Merelda tilted her head. "Prove it." Silence. 3 years, Darius, 3 years and no child. The physicians whisper, the midwives gossip. Even your own advisory council has raised the question in closed session, though I see they lack the courage to raise it here. Her eyes swept the room, lingering on faces that looked away. The Valamont bloodline is dying, and you sit there clinging to a woman who cannot save it because you are too proud to admit you made a mistake. Darius opened his mouth, closed it. The vein in his neck was throbbing hard enough to see from 10 feet away. "I did not come here to humiliate you," Merelda said, and the lie was so smooth it could have been truth if you were not listening carefully. "I came to offer a solution. Celestine is young. She is healthy. She carries noble blood, and she has been trained since birth to serve this empire. Step aside, Celine. Relinquish your position willingly, and I will ensure you are given an estate in the eastern provinces. Comfortable, quiet, a dignified retreat." "A cage," Celine said, "with a garden, a mercy. Considering the alternative." "And what alternative is that?" Merelda's smile returned, and this time it was the real one. The one she kept hidden behind the rehearsed version. It was cold, flat, the smile of a woman who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for reality to catch up. "The alternative is that the court decides for you, and courts are not known for their mercy." The hall trembled on the edge of something. Celine could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against her, waiting for her to crack, to weep, to rise in fury, and give Merelda exactly the spectacle she needed to justify what came next. That was the trap. Emotion was the trap. Any reaction at all was a surrender dressed in different clothes. Celine looked at Merelda, then at Cassian. Then, slowly, she let her gaze travel across the entire hall, meeting eyes, reading faces, counting allies and enemies with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has been doing this math for years. Then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not defiant. It was not bitter or mocking or brave. It was the smile of someone who has just finished reading the last page of a book everyone else is still on chapter 1 of. A smile that said, "I know something you do not, and by the time you learn it, it will be too late." Merelda saw it, and for the first time that evening, something moved behind her eyes that was not confidence. "You have said your piece," Celine said. "The court has heard you. I have heard you. And I will give you my answer, but not tonight. Tonight is when—" "Not tonight." Celine's voice dropped by half a register, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop with it. "You came here to force a decision under pressure, in front of witnesses, before anyone had time to think. That is the tactic of a merchant, Merelda, not a stateswoman, and I am not a merchant's customer to be bullied into a purchase." Merelda's jaw tightened. Beside her, Cassian shifted again, and this time Celine caught the flicker of his eyes toward the left side of the hall, where a cluster of minor lords sat in a tight formation that was too organized to be accidental. She noted it, filed it, The moon ceremony is in 14 days, Celine continued. The entire kingdom will be present. Every lord, every house, every minister. If you want the empire to hear your case, you will make it there. In full. With evidence. With witnesses. Before the law, and the court, and the throne. And I will answer you there. You are stalling. I am following protocol. Something your husband understood, even if you never did. The insult was precise and personal, and it landed with the impact Celine intended. Merelda's nostrils flared. Her hands, clasped in front of her, tightened until the tendons stood out like cables. 14 days, Merelda said. Fine. 14 days. She turned to leave, then stopped, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that was pure theater. But I want you to know something, Celine. Every day you sit on that throne is another day you steal from someone who deserves it more. And thieves, in this empire, lose more than their crowns. She walked out the way she had walked in. Unhurried. Unbroken. Cassian followed half a step behind, his hand settling on the small of her back with a familiarity that told the room everything Merelda had not said aloud. The doors closed behind them. The hall exhaled. Slowly, in pieces, like a building settling after a tremor. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more careful. The banquet had become a crime scene, and everyone present was simultaneously a witness and a suspect. Darius sat down heavily. He looked at Celine, and there was something raw in his face now, something stripped of the kingly mask he wore so poorly. Celine, not here. We need to... Not here, Darius. He fell silent. She could feel his frustration like heat off a forge, and she understood it, even sympathized with it in some distant clinical way. He wanted to fix things. Men like Darius always wanted to fix things, immediately, loudly, with the blunt instruments they understood. But Merelda had not brought a blunt instrument tonight. She had brought a scalpel, and you do not fight a scalpel with a hammer. Celine rose from her chair. The motion was smooth, unhurried, and every eye in the hall tracked it. She lifted her goblet, the one she had not touched all evening, and raised it just slightly. To the Empire, she said. Her voice carried. A beat of silence. Then, like trained animals responding to a command they barely understood, the courtiers raised their own glasses. To the Empire, they echoed. She set her goblet down without drinking. Then she walked out of the grand hall through the private corridor behind the throne, her footsteps measured and even on the cold stone. She made it 40 paces before she stopped. The corridor was empty. Dark, except for a single torch guttering in its bracket. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. And for 3 seconds only, she let the mask fall. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the sustained effort of keeping everything inside, of holding still while the world tried to crack her open. Her breath came in short, ragged pulls, and she pressed one palm flat against her stomach, against the emptiness there that Merelda had named in front of 1,200 people. Barren. The word echoed in the dark corridor like a stone dropped down a well. She had heard it before, in physicians' voices, carefully neutral, in the tight silences that followed monthly disappointments, in the way Darius touched her lately, careful and distant, as though she were something fragile that had already broken, and he was just going through the motions of pretending it was whole. She was not fragile. She had never been fragile. But there are wounds that have nothing to do with strength, wounds that sit in places armor cannot reach, and the absence of a child was one of them. Not because she needed an heir to validate her crown, because she had wanted one. Quietly, privately, in the one part of her heart that she had never shown anyone, she had wanted a child the way you want water when you are dying of thirst. And the wanting had become a silence, and the silence had become a wall, and now that wall was all anyone could see. 3 seconds. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and walked on. Her private chambers were on the 4th floor of the eastern tower, 3 locked doors and 2 armed guards separating her from the rest of the palace. She dismissed the guards with a nod and shut the heavy oak door behind her. The room was sparse for an empress. A writing desk stacked with documents. A narrow bed. Maps pinned to one wall with iron tacks. And on the desk, half hidden beneath a sheaf of tax reports, a leather-bound ledger that did not belong to any official record. Celine sat at the desk and opened the ledger. The pages were dense with her own handwriting, small, precise, compressed. Names, dates, amounts, lines of connection drawn between people and places and shipments of gold. 3 months of silent, painstaking work. Every bribed official, every redirected shipment, every sealed letter that had passed between Merelda's household and the advisory council. She turned to the most recent page and added a note. Cassian Drake, present at banquet. Physical contact with Merelda suggests established relationship, minimum several months. Eye contact with Lord Harwood's block suggests coordination. Coalition in left gallery, numbered approximately 14. She stared at the page for a long moment. Then she opened a drawer, removed a second document, and spread it flat on the desk. It was a letter, intercepted 6 days ago, by a maid in Merelda's household, whose loyalty Celine had purchased with something more valuable than gold. Information. The maid had a son in the Imperial Army who had been sentenced to the border garrisons on a fabricated charge. Celine had found the fabrication, corrected it. The son was now stationed in the capital, safe and warm, and convinced his transfer was routine. The letter was written in Cassian Drake's hand, elegant slanted script that pressed too hard into the paper, as though the writer was trying to leave a mark deeper than ink. The contents made Celine's stomach tighten, not with surprise. She was past surprise, but with the cold recognition of something she had suspected for weeks finally taking solid form. The letter outlined a schedule, specific dates, specific dosages, a gradual, untraceable method of weakening a healthy man over the course of several months until his organs failed and his death appeared natural. The target was not named. It did not need to be. There was only one man in the Empire whose slow death would clear the path Merelda needed, Darius. Celine read the letter again, then a third time. Then she folded it carefully, returned it to the drawer, and locked the drawer with a key she wore on a chain beneath her gown, against her skin, where it had hung for 6 days like a second heartbeat. She sat in the dark for a long time after that, thinking. Not about the letter. She had already done her thinking about the letter. She was thinking about the smile she had given Merelda in the grand hall, and whether it had been too much, whether it had revealed too much, whether the mask had slipped, just fractionally, in the wrong direction, letting Merelda see not composure, but something sharper. Something that might make a careful woman accelerate her plans. A knock at the door, 3 raps, spaced evenly. Thorn's knock. Enter. The Lord Chancellor slid through the door like something boneless, closing it behind him with both hands. His face was gray. The sweat on his upper lip had been joined by a twin line across his forehead, and his eyes had the scattered quality of a man trying to watch too many things at once. Your Majesty, forgive the hour. Sit down, Thorn. You look like a man who has been carrying something heavy. He sat, heavily. The chair groaned under him even though he was not a large man. Everything about Thorn groaned lately. His joints, his conscience, his carefully maintained position between factions that were pulling further apart by the day. The banquet is unraveling, he said. Half the lords left within 20 minutes of your departure. The other half are clustered in the South Gallery trading rumors so fast I cannot track them all. Good. Good? Rumors are noisy. Noisy men are not conspiring. They are performing. The ones I need to worry about are the quiet ones, the ones who left early. Thorn blinked. You have a list. I have a list. He stared at her for a moment, and in his eyes was a look she had seen many times in the faces of men who had underestimated her. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recalibration. The moment when a chess player realizes the board is not arranged the way they thought it was. Your Majesty, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without reaching for a knife. I have never reached for a knife, Thorn. That is for people with short reach. He almost smiled. The Advisory Council held a closed session 2 days ago. I was not invited. When I inquired, I was told it was a routine fiscal review. It was not. No. They discussed the succession. I know. Thorn paused. You know. Lord Aldrich Montague's valet drinks at the Broken Wheel Tavern on Tuesdays. He talks when he drinks. My people listen when he talks. Your people. Everyone has people, Thorn. The question is whether your people are listening to the right conversations. He leaned forward. The council is split. 7 members support Merelda's petition to elevate Celestine. 5 remain loyal to you. 3 are undecided. And the undecided ones are the ones Cassian Drake has been visiting for the past month. I know about Drake's visits. Do you know what he is offering them? Land grants from the northern territories. Estates confiscated from border lords who died in the skirmishes. territory that does not legally belong to Merelda and cannot legally be offered by anyone outside the crown. Thorn sat back. The look in his eyes shifted from recalibration to something approaching alarm. How long have you known? Longer than I should have had to. If the Chancellor's intelligence network were functioning, I would not have needed to build my own. The rebuke was gentle but precise, and Thorn absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, with a slight tightening around the eyes and a nod that conceded more than he would ever say aloud. What do you intend to do? Celine looked at him, looked through him really, to the wall of maps behind him, to the red threads she had pinned between locations, tracing the movement of gold and loyalty and betrayal across the empire like blood vessels in a body that was slowly poisoning itself. Merelda wants the moon ceremony to be her coronation. She wants to walk into that hall with the court already turned, the council already decided, and the throne already empty. She wants me kneeling. She wants Darius sidelined. She wants Celestine crowned and Cassian installed as her weapon inside the palace. And instead? Instead, the moon ceremony will be something else entirely. What? Celine turned back to him, and the candlelight caught her face at an angle that carved shadows from her cheekbones, and turned her eyes into something dark and bright at the same time, like a lantern burning behind smoked glass. A trial. Thorn's breath stopped, just for a second. Then it started again, carefully, as though he was afraid breathing too hard might set something off. A trial, he repeated. For whom? For everyone who has betrayed this crown. Starting with the one who plans to murder my husband. The silence in the room was absolute. Not the silence of the grand hall, which had been pregnant with spectacle. This was smaller, tighter. The silence of a fuse burning towards something that had no intention of being small. Thorn's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Murder? I have the letter, Thorn. I have the dosages, I have the schedule, and I have the name of the physician who has been administering them under the guise of treating Darius's headaches for the past 2 months. The color drained from Thorn's face so completely that for a moment he looked like a man made of paper. 2 months, he whispered. Darius has been losing weight, sleeping poorly, complaining of pain behind his eyes. He thinks it is the stress of the border campaigns. He is wrong. Does he know? No. When will you tell him? Celine's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it, something deep and careful, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut. When I am certain he will believe me, and not a moment before. Thorn stared at her. Then he stood, and the motion was slow, weighted with the understanding that he had walked into this room as one kind of man and was leaving it as another. What do you need from me? Your silence, your access to the treasury records, and your answer to one question. Ask it. When the council held their closed session to discuss removing me, whose name was on the list of proposed successors? Thorn's throat worked. He knew the answer would cost something. He gave it anyway. Celestine Ashworth, Lord Cassian Drake as royal consort, and Lady Merelda as regent until Celestine produces an heir. Regent. Celine let the words sit in the air between them. Merelda does not want to put her daughter on the throne. She wants to sit behind it. Celestine is the face, Drake is the muscle, and Merelda is the hand that moves them both. Yes. Then in 14 days I will cut off the hand. Thorn left without another word. The door closed behind him, and Celine was alone again. She blew out the candle on her desk and sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the palace settling around her. Distant laughter from a courtyard. The footsteps of guards on stone. The slow, measured tick of the clock on her mantle counting down the 14 days she had given herself to dismantle everything Merelda had built. 14 days. Not because she needed 14 days. Because she wanted Merelda to have them. Wanted her to spend every one of those days believing her plan was working, believing the court was turning, believing Celine was crumbling quietly behind locked doors. She wanted Merelda comfortable. She wanted Merelda confident. She wanted Merelda standing in the center of that ceremonial hall with a smile on her face and absolute certainty in her chest, surrounded by every ally she had purchased and every lie she had told, in the one moment when the distance between triumph and destruction was a single breath. And then she wanted to watch that certainty die. Celine reached for the chain around her neck, pressing the key against her breastbone until the metal edges bit into her skin. She thought of Darius, asleep somewhere in this palace, his body slowly being hollowed out by a poison he did not know he was swallowing. She thought of Cassian Drake's smile, all teeth and nothing behind it. She thought of Merelda's crimson gown trailing across the marble like blood. And in the darkness of her chamber, Empress Selene Vale began to plan. Not revenge. Revenge was the tool of amateurs. What she planned was far worse. She planned to let them win. Let them believe they had won. Let every piece fall into place, every bribe land, every alliance lock. Let the web close around her so tightly that no one in the Empire believed she could escape it. And then she planned to become the thing that made the web irrelevant. Somewhere below her tower, in a guest chamber that smelled of imported wine and ambition, Cassian Drake was writing another letter. She knew this because the maid would bring her a copy by dawn. And somewhere in the eastern wing, Darius was lying awake, staring at a ceiling he could barely see, wondering when his wife had become a stranger. He did not know. None of them knew. The Empress they had dismissed as silent, as broken, as barren and empty and finished, was the most dangerous person in the Empire. And in 14 days, every single one of them was going to find out why. But what Selene did not know, what she could not have known as she sat in the dark pressing a key against her heart, was that she was not the only one counting down the days. In a chamber on the far side of the palace, behind a door that had no guard and bore no name, someone was reading a letter of their own. A letter that contained not schedules and dosages, but a single instruction, written in a hand that did not belong to Merelda or Cassian or anyone Selene had yet added to her ledger. The instruction was simple. 3 words. Kill the Empress. Orchestrated cinematic screenplay continuation with dialogue-heavy narrative and embedded philosophy. Orchestrated cinematic screenplay. Continuation with dialogue-heavy narrative and embedded philosophy. The letter arrived in Selene's hands before the sun cleared the eastern wall. The maid, a thin woman named Cora, whose face carried the permanent exhaustion of someone who had learned to survive by being invisible, placed it on the desk without a word and left through the servants' passage behind the tapestry. She did not linger. She never lingered. That was why Selene trusted her. Selene unfolded the copy of Cassian Drake's latest correspondence and read it standing, her back to the window where gray morning light pressed through glass that needed cleaning. The letter was addressed to a name she did not recognize, Lord Wyston Hale. She turned the name over in her mind the way she would turn a coin found in the street, checking both sides for markings. Nothing. No face attached to it, no house, no title she had encountered in 3 years of navigating this court. A ghost. Or worse, someone who had been deliberately kept out of her sight. She read the letter twice. It was short, businesslike. The language was stripped of Cassian's usual flourish, which meant he was writing to someone he considered an equal or a superior. The contents dealt with a shipment. 12 crates of Andari wine from the southern provinces, arriving at the palace cellars within the week. Routine, except that the Andari vineyards had been burned during the border conflicts 2 months ago. There was no Andari wine to ship, which meant the crates contained something else. Selene folded the letter and added it to the ledger. Then she dressed, alone, without calling for attendants, pulling her hair back with the same brutal tightness she always used, as though daring anyone to find a crack in the surface. The palace corridors at dawn were a different country from the palace at night. No courtiers, no performers. Just cold stone and the distant sound of boots on patrol routes and kitchen smoke, drifting up through ventilation shafts that had been cut into the walls 3 centuries ago. Selene walked through them the way she walked through everything, with the measured economy of a woman who understood that every step was observed even when the observers were not visible. She found Darius in the training yard. He was shirtless, working a practice sword against a wooden post, with the kind of mechanical fury that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with whatever was eating him from the inside. Sweat ran in sheets down his back. His strikes were sloppy, wide, driven more by his shoulders than his hips, and each one landed with a sound like a butcher hitting a block. He had been at it for a while. The post was splintered at chest height. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched him. There had been a time when watching him move made her feel something warm and private, a recognition of the body she had chosen, the man she had bet her life on. Now she watched him the way she watched everything, with calculation, with the steady, exhausting awareness that the man she had married was both her greatest asset and her most dangerous vulnerability. "You will split that post before breakfast," she said. He stopped mid-swing, turned. His chest heaved, and the sweat on his face caught the light in a way that made him look younger than he was. younger and more lost. Could not sleep, he said. I know. How do you know? Because you are here at dawn beating wood with a sword instead of being in your chambers, Darius. It is not a difficult deduction. He drove the practice blade into the dirt and walked toward her, grabbing a cloth from a bench to drag across his face. Up close, the damage was clearer. The hollows under his eyes had deepened. His skin had a grayish undertone that had not been there 6 months ago, a dullness that no amount of sunlight or sleep could explain. The poison, working slowly, exactly as the letter described, weakening him by degrees so small that no single day seemed different from the last. Celine's chest tightened. She could tell him. Right now. 3 sentences would do it. Someone is poisoning you. It is coming through your physician. I have proof. 3 sentences, and the immediate threat would end. He would dismiss the physician, change his food tasters, double his guard. And then Merelda would know that Celine knew. The evidence trail would vanish within hours. The conspirators would scatter, regroup, find a new approach. And the next attempt would not be gradual. It would be a knife in the dark, fast and final and impossible to predict. She needed Merelda confident. She needed the conspiracy intact, visible, traceable. She needed it alive so she could kill it all at once, which meant she needed Darius to keep drinking the poison for 12 more days. The math was monstrous. She knew that. She carried the weight of it in her body like a stone sewn into her gut, and some nights it pressed so hard against her lungs that breathing felt like an act of will. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was saving him now and losing him later, in a way she could not prevent because she would never see it coming. Survival was not clean. It was not kind. It did not wait for you to feel good about your choices before it forced you to make them. We need to talk about Merelda, Darius said. He sat on the bench and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the posture made him look less like a king and more like a man sitting in a physician's waiting room, expecting bad news. Yes. Last night was calculated, precise, rehearsed down to the dress she wore and the boy she brought on her arm. None of it was spontaneous, Darius. She planned that entrance the way a general plans a siege. I know that. Do you? Because when she called me Baron in front of the entire court, you sat there for 11 seconds before you said a word. I counted. The blow landed. She saw it in the way his spine straightened, the way his jaw pulled tight against the bone. I was not prepared. She was. That is the difference. Silence. The training yard was empty except for the 2 of them and a pair of stable boys mucking out stalls on the far side who were too far away to hear and too smart to listen even if they could. What do you want me to do? Darius asked. And there it was. The question she had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Because the honest answer was, I want you to trust me without asking why, and trust was the one thing this marriage had been hemorrhaging for months. I want you to do nothing. Nothing. For 12 days. I want you to attend your councils. Hear your advisors. Nod when they speak. Agree to nothing. Sign nothing. Change nothing. Let the current carry you. While Merelda turns the entire court against us. Against me. Let her. I need her to believe she is winning. Darius stared at her. The sweat was drying on his skin, leaving salt tracks that made him look older, cracked, like a fresco exposed to weather. You have a plan, he said, not a question. I have more than a plan. I have proof. Proof of what? 12 days, Darius. No, tell me now. If I tell you now, you will act on it. You will act on it because you are a man who solves problems with force and speed, and this problem requires neither. If you move too early, you will destroy the only advantage I have. What advantage? They think I am weak. He looked at her for a long time. The training yard was quiet except for the sound of horses and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer starting the day's work. You are asking me to sit still while my wife fights a war I do not understand. I am asking you to trust that when I fight it, I will win. She turned and walked away before he could answer, because she could not afford to see whatever his face would do next. She could not afford doubt. Not his, and especially not her own. The days that followed moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of a millstone. Merelda did not waste a single one. By the second day, the rumor had metastasized from court gossip into something structural. Three noble houses in the western provinces sent formal letters to the advisory council requesting clarification on the succession. The language was diplomatic. The intent was not. They wanted to know if the Empress could produce an heir, and if not, what provisions the crown had made. The letters bore seals that Celine recognized from Cassian Drake's travel records. He had visited each of those houses within the last 6 weeks. By the 4th day, the Physicians' Guild issued a statement, carefully worded, studiously neutral. Noting that the imperial marriage had not produced issue in 3 years, and suggesting, in language wrapped in so many qualifications it could barely breathe, that the crown might consider a medical evaluation of both the king and the Empress. Celine read the statement in her chambers and felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, the one she had stopped trying to name because naming it would give it power. She set the document aside and returned to her ledger. By the 6th day, Darius stopped coming to her chambers at night. No explanation, no argument. Just an absence, a door that stayed closed, a side of the bed that stayed cold. She heard from Thorne that the advisory council was meeting daily now, in sessions that ran past midnight, and that Darius attended them with the hollow-eyed compliance of a man who had stopped trying to steer and was simply letting the current take him where it would. She let it happen, all of it, every defection, every whisper, every sealed letter and sidelong glance. She absorbed the blows the way old stone absorbs rain, letting the water run over the surface without penetrating, because the structure beneath was harder than anything they could throw at it. On the 7th night, Thorne came to her chambers with a face the color of wet ash. Montague has turned. Celine did not look up from the ledger. When? This afternoon. He met with Drake in the South Gallery for 40 minutes. My man could not get close enough to hear the conversation, but Montague left the meeting and went directly to the council chamber. He has thrown his support behind Celestine's elevation. That gives Merelda 8 votes on the council. Majority. Yes. Good. Thorne's composure, already threadbare, frayed visibly. Good? Your Majesty, with all respect, the council now has a legal majority to call for your removal. If Merelda presses the matter at the moon ceremony, she will. Then you will be deposed, formally, legally, with the full weight of the council behind it. Thorne. Celine finally looked up, and the candlelight turned her face into something that made the Lord Chancellor take a half-step backward, without meaning to. If I wanted to stop Montague from turning, I could have. I have a letter in this ledger from his own steward documenting the sale of crown timber to foreign merchants at a profit that never reached the treasury. I could have presented it to him this morning and purchased his loyalty with the threat of exposure. I chose not to. Why? Because a man whose loyalty is purchased can be purchased again by someone with a higher price. I do not want purchased men, Thorne. I want the ones who turned against me standing in that hall on the night of the ceremony, wearing their treason openly, so that when I take them apart, there is no ambiguity about who they are or what they chose. Thorne sat down slowly. You want them committed. I want them irreversible. I want every conspirator locked into a position they cannot retreat from. I want Merelda's coalition so large and so visible that when it falls, there is nowhere to hide. And if it does not fall? If something goes wrong? Then I will have lost. And losing in this empire means something very specific for a woman in my position. She said it without self-pity, without drama. A flat statement of fact, delivered with the same tone she might use to describe the weather. Thorne left. Celine locked the door behind him and returned to her desk, where she opened the second drawer and removed not the poison letter, but something newer. A report from Cora, delivered 3 hours ago, containing information that had rearranged the entire architecture of what Celine thought she understood. The 12 crates of Endari wine had arrived at the palace cellars that morning. Cora had managed to pry the lid of one while the cellar master was occupied. Inside, packed in straw, were not bottles but ledgers, dozens of them, financial records bearing the seals of 6 noble houses, the imperial treasury, and the office of the Lord Chancellor himself. Celine read the report again. The seals of 6 noble houses, the imperial treasury, and the Lord Chancellor, Thorne. Her hand stopped moving. She set the pen down carefully, as though it had become something fragile, and stared at the name. Thorne. The man who had sat in this room not 30 minutes ago, with his gray face and his careful concern. The man who had been feeding her information about the council's movements, about Montague, about Drake. The man she had trusted not because she believed in his loyalty, but because she believed she understood his self-interest. Was he playing both sides? Had he always been? Was every piece of intelligence he had given her curated, selected, shaped to steer her toward conclusions that served Merelda's timeline? Or was there a third possibility, one she had not considered because she had been so focused on the enemy in front of her that she had failed to look for the one standing beside her? What if Thorn was not working for Merelda at all? What if Thorn was working for himself? Celine pressed her palms flat against the desk and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she did when the world shifted underfoot and she needed to find solid ground before she could move. 7 days left until the moon ceremony. 7 days to rebuild an intelligence network she could no longer trust, to verify every piece of information she had collected through a channel that might be compromised, to separate the true from the planted with nothing but her own judgment and the work of a maid whose loyalty was tied to a single transferred soldier. 7 days. And somewhere in this palace, a letter with 3 words on it was still waiting to be fulfilled. Kill the Empress. She did not know who had written it. She did not know who carried it. She did not know if the threat was real or a piece of theater designed to flush her into a mistake. But she knew one thing with the bone-deep certainty that had kept her alive since childhood, since the cold room and the last plate and the hand-me-down dresses that never fit. She would not run. She would not hide. She would not beg for mercy from people who had never shown her any. She would walk into that ceremony hall in 7 days with every weapon she had, and she would burn the conspiracy to the ground, or she would burn with it. There was no third option. There had never been a third option. The moment Merelda walked through those banquet doors, the fuse had been lit, and now the only question was who would be standing when the blast cleared. Celine pulled the chain from beneath her gown and held the key in her fist. The metal was warm from her skin. She squeezed it until the edges cut. Then she opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote a single name at the top, Edric Thorn. And beneath it, in handwriting that did not shake, she wrote, Verify everything, trust nothing, 7 days. Celine spent 3 of her 7 remaining days dismantling her own intelligence network and rebuilding it from nothing. She started with Cora, sat the woman down in the servants' passage behind the tapestry at an hour when the corridor traffic was non-existent, and asked her one question. Not whether Thorn was trustworthy, not whether the information he had provided was accurate. She asked Cora how long the cellar master had been away from the crates before Cora opened them. Cora thought about it. 10 minutes, she said. Maybe 12. Celine asked how long it would take to pry a lid, examine the contents, reseal the crate, and leave without a trace. Cora's face changed. 4 minutes, she said. 5 at most. Which meant there had been 7 minutes of unaccounted absence. 7 minutes during which a cellar master who should have been supervising a sensitive delivery had simply walked away, as though someone had told him to. Celine dismissed Cora and sat alone in the passage for a long time, her back against the cold wall, thinking about the architecture of what she was facing. The crates had been meant to be found. The ledgers inside them, bearing Thorn's seal among others, had been placed where Cora could reach them because someone wanted Celine to find them. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Thorn was genuinely compromised, and Merelda wanted Celine to know it, to isolate her from her last remaining ally inside the council. Or Thorn was clean, and someone was forging his seal to drive a wedge between the Empress and the one man in the palace who still brought her information. Both possibilities were weapons. Both were designed to make her act, and acting without certainty was exactly what her enemies needed. She chose a third path. She would treat Thorn as neither ally nor enemy, but as a variable. She would continue to meet with him, continue to receive his reports, but she would verify every piece of information through a second channel before she let it touch her plans. The second channel was not Cora. It was not anyone in the palace. It was a clerk in the treasury named Orrin Blackwell, a man so deeply buried in the bureaucratic machinery of the empire that no one with political ambitions had ever thought to notice him. Celine had noticed him 14 months ago, when a discrepancy in the grain tariffs had led her, through a chain of documents so convoluted it would have driven most investigators to madness, to a single correction made in a ledger margin. The correction was unsigned, but it had saved the treasury 11,000 gold marks. She had found Blackwell. She had not recruited him. She had simply remembered his name and the quality of his work, and filed both away for a day when she might need someone whose loyalty was to numbers rather than people. That day had arrived. She sent Blackwell a note through the palace's internal document system, buried inside a routine request for quarterly tax assessments. The note asked for one thing: a complete audit trail of every transaction bearing the Lord Chancellor's seal in the past 6 months, cross-referenced against Thorn's known schedule of travel, illness, and leave. If the seals on the ledgers in those crates were genuine, the audit trail would show it. If they were forged, the discrepancies would surface like bones in shallow water. Blackwell's response arrived 2 days later, on the morning of the 5th day before the moon ceremony. It was thorough, meticulous, and devastating, though not in the direction Celine had expected. Thorne's seal was genuine. The ledgers in the crates bore his authentic mark, verified against 17 separate control documents. But the transactions they recorded were not bribes or conspiracies. They were transfers. Large sums moved from the imperial treasury into a private account held under a name Celine did not recognize. The transfers had been occurring monthly for 11 months, and the private account was registered not to Merelda, not to Cash and Drake, not to any member of the advisory council. It was registered to Darius. Celine read Blackwell's report standing at her desk, and she did not sit down for a very long time. 11 months. The transfers had started 2 months before the sealed letter that Darius had burned without telling her its contents. 2 months before the distance, before the silences, before the slow, methodical dismantling of the marriage she had thought was under attack from outside, when in fact it had been hemorrhaging from within. She forced herself to think clearly, forced herself past the white noise of something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them like a frequency that rattles the chest without producing a sound you can name. Darius had been moving gold out of the treasury into a hidden account. Thorne had been facilitating it. Neither had told her. And the ledgers documenting these transfers had been packed into crates and shipped to the palace cellars, where they had been placed in a position to be found. By whom? That was the question that mattered now. Who had packed those crates, and who had wanted Celine to find their contents? She thought of Merelda. Merelda, who had stormed the banquet with accusations of barrenness and unworthiness. Merelda, whose conspiracy Celine had spent 3 months mapping with the painstaking care of a cartographer charting hostile territory. Merelda, whose poison letter and bribed officials and turned council members had formed a picture so clear, so complete, that Celine had never once questioned whether the frame was showing her the whole canvas. It was not. The canvas was larger than she had imagined, and the parts she could not see were the parts that mattered most. On the 4th evening before the ceremony, Celine broke her own protocol and went to Darius. She found him in his private study, a room she had not entered in weeks. The door was unlocked, which was unusual. The room smelled of stale wine and lamp oil burning low. Maps covered the walls, pinned at odd angles, some of them marked with notations she did not recognize. Darius was seated behind his desk with a goblet in front of him, and when she entered, his face did something complicated that started as surprise, moved through guilt, and settled into a wariness she had never seen him direct at her before. "Celine, tell me about the account." He did not ask which account. He did not feign confusion. His hand moved to the goblet, wrapped around it, and held on as though it were the only solid object in the room. "How much do you know?" he said. "Enough to be here instead of in my chambers preparing for the ceremony. Not enough to understand why." Darius stood, walked to the window, put his back to her, which was either trust or carelessness, and with Darius it was always difficult to tell the difference. 800,000 gold marks, he said. His voice had the flat quality of a confession delivered to an empty room. Moved over 11 months into a secured account under a cipher name. Your cipher name? Yes. Facilitated by Thorne. Thorne does what I tell him to do. That is his function. His function is to serve the crown. The crown includes me. Darius turned. The lamplight caught the hollows under his eyes, the grayish skin, the thinning frame. The poison's work, patient and relentless, written on his body in a language he still could not read. It does include you, but, he said. And it was you I was trying to protect. The words sat between them like an object neither of them wanted to pick up. Explain that, Celine said. The letter. The one I burned. It was from the border commander in the northern provinces. Not a military report. A warning. He had intercepted communications between 3 noble houses and an envoy from the Caliph Confederacy. They were negotiating an alliance. Military support in exchange for territorial concessions after a change of leadership in Ashenmere. A foreign-backed coup, funded, organized, with a timeline. The border commander estimated 6 months before the Confederacy would be in position to move troops across the Ashenmere frontier. That was 8 months ago. Celine felt the ground shift. Not metaphorically. Something in her actual body recalibrated, a tightening in the muscles along her spine, a sharpening of her vision that came with the particular chemical honesty of fear. The gold, she said, moved to purchase mercenary companies along the Eastern Corridor, 1,200 soldiers under contract, stationed outside the Empire's borders, paid through intermediaries that cannot be traced back to the throne. If the Confederacy moves, those mercenaries hit their flank before they reach our frontier. You built a shadow army. I built a contingency, because the Advisory Council refused to authorize military spending, and the Treasury was bleeding from the border skirmishes. And every time I tried to raise the issue in session, someone changed the subject, or tabled the discussion, or buried it in committee. Someone who did not want the crown prepared for what was coming. Merelda's allies on the council. I do not know if she is connected to the Confederacy directly, but I know that the same people blocking my military funding are the same people pushing for Celestine's elevation. And I know that a change of leadership is exactly what the Confederacy needs to justify intervention. Celine stood very still. The room was small and close, and smelled of decisions made in isolation by a man who had stopped trusting anyone, including her. 8 months, she said. You have known about this for 8 months, and you told me nothing. You could not risk trusting your wife. The sentence landed with a precision that left no room for deflection. Darius's mouth opened, and nothing came out, and the silence that followed was worse than anything Merelda had said in the Grand Hall, because it was not performed for an audience. It was just two people standing in a room with the wreckage of something that should have been stronger than this. I was trying to protect you, he said again, and this time the words sounded different, thinner, like a rope that has been bearing weight for too long and is starting to fray from the center. You were trying to protect yourself from the possibility that I might disagree, that I might demand a different approach, that I might be a partner instead of a piece on your board. That is not 800,000 gold marks moved without my knowledge, a shadow army contracted without my seal, a foreign threat concealed from the Empress of a country that is 2 months from invasion. And you stood in that training yard 6 days ago and asked me what I wanted you to do, as though you were a man without options. You had options, Darius. You simply made them alone. His jaw worked. The vein in his neck, the one that always gave him away, was pulsing hard enough to see from across the room. And if I had told you, what would you have done? I would have done what I am doing now, except I would have done it with 8 months of preparation instead of 4 days. She turned toward the door, stopped, did not look back. Someone in this palace has been ordered to kill me. Did you know that? The silence behind her was absolute. When Darius spoke, his voice had changed. The flatness was gone. What replaced it was something raw, cracked open, the sound of a man hearing something that rearranges every assumption he has been operating under. What did you say? A letter. 3 words. Kill the Empress. I do not know who wrote it. I do not know who carries it. I have known for 12 days, and I have spent those 12 days preparing for a ceremony I believed would end Merelda's conspiracy. But the conspiracy I was fighting was only half the picture. The other half was yours. And now I have 4 days to reconcile 2 separate wars being fought inside the same walls, by people who should have been fighting together. She opened the door. The corridor beyond was dark and empty. Celine, wait. She did not wait. She walked out and pulled the door shut behind her, and the sound it made was quiet, controlled, and final. 3 days before the moon ceremony, Celine sat in her chambers at midnight, the ledger open on her desk, and rebuilt everything from scratch. The picture she had been assembling for 3 months was wrong, not entirely. The pieces were real. Relda's corruption, Cashin's poison plot, the turned council members, the bribed officials, all of it was real. But it was not complete. It was one layer of a structure that had at least 2 more beneath it, and she had been so focused on the surface that she had missed the foundations. Layer 1. Merelda's domestic conspiracy. The power grab. Celestine as puppet empress, Cashin as enforcer, Merelda as puppet master. Funded by stolen gold, supported by turned nobles. Executed through the slow poisoning of the king and the public destruction of the queen. This was real. This was happening. And it was, in the grand architecture of what was actually at play, almost a distraction. Layer 2. The Confederacy Alliance. Foreign military power waiting for internal instability to justify intervention. Noble houses negotiating territorial concessions. A timeline that was now 2 months from execution. Darius had seen this layer and responded with a shadow army funded through secret treasury transfers. He had told no one. He had trusted no one. And in doing so, he had created a vulnerability that Merelda's allies could exploit at any time, simply by exposing the transfers and accusing the king of embezzlement. Layer 3. The one she could not see. The letter. Kill the Empress. Written by someone outside both conspiracies, someone whose name had not appeared in any ledger, any report, any intercepted correspondence. Someone who wanted Selene dead, not because she was in the way of Merelda's throne or the Confederacy's invasion, but for a reason Selene had not yet identified. 3 layers, 4 days. And the moon ceremony was no longer just a stage for exposing Merelda. It was the convergence point of every threat in the Empire. A single night when every faction would be present, every weapon drawn, every mask removed. She could cancel, postpone, find an excuse to delay the ceremony and buy herself more time. But time was the one resource she no longer had. The Confederacy's timeline was running. Darius's health was deteriorating, and every day the conspiracy remained intact was another day the Empire bled from wounds it did not know it had. Selene closed the ledger, opened the drawer, removed the poison letter, the treasury audit, the report from Cora, the intercepted correspondence from Cash and Drake. She laid them all on the desk in a line, like cards in a hand she was about to play, and looked at them with the unflinching clarity of a woman who has just realized that the game she thought she was playing is not the game she is in. She had entered this fight as an empress defending her crown. Patient, calculated, strategic, playing within the rules of a court system she understood, using evidence and protocol and the slow machinery of justice to dismantle her enemies piece by piece. That woman could not win this. The threat was too large, too layered, too deeply embedded in the structure of the empire itself. An empress who played by the rules would be destroyed by people who had rewritten them months ago. Something had to change. Not her plan. Her. Selene stood, walked to the mirror on the far wall of her chamber, looked at the face reflected back at her, the tight hair, the controlled expression, the careful calibrated stillness she had worn like armor since childhood, since the cold room and the empty plate, and the silence that had been her only weapon when she had no others. That silence had kept her alive. It had carried her from a seamstress's daughter to an empress. It had held her together through 3 years of whispered cruelty and public doubt and the slow erosion of a marriage she had believed in more than she had ever admitted. But silence was a defensive weapon. And what she needed now was not defense. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. One by one, slowly, until it fell past her shoulders in a dark wave she had not allowed anyone to see in years. The woman in the mirror looked different without the tightness, younger, rawer, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the absence of it. She left the pins on the floor, sat back down at the desk, and began to write. Not in the ledger, on a fresh sheet of paper, in handwriting that was larger and faster and less controlled than anything she had committed to the page in years. A plan. Not the careful, layered, evidence-based strategy she had been building for months. Something else. Something with teeth. If she could not play within the rules, she would use the moon ceremony to break every single one of them. She would not just expose Merelda, she would detonate the entire structure, the poison, the treasury transfers, the Confederacy alliance, the turned council, everything, all of it, in a single night, in front of everyone, with no regard for protocol or precedent or the careful political calculus that had governed her every move since she took the crown. It would be chaos. It would be brutal. It would burn alliances she might need later and create enemies she could not predict. It would terrify the court, destabilize the council, and force the empire to stare directly into the rot. What it had been pretending did not exist, and it might not work. That was the part she could not calculate, the part that required something other than strategy. It required the willingness to lose everything. Not as a possibility to be managed, but as a price she was prepared to pay. She wrote until the candle burned to a stump, and the first gray light of the third-to-last day crept through the window. Then she folded the paper, pressed it flat, and placed it inside her gown, against her chest, next to the key she had been carrying for weeks. 2 weapons now. The key to the evidence that could destroy her enemies, and a plan that could destroy everything else, including herself. 4 days from now, she would walk into that ceremony hall carrying both, and only one of them would come back out. The Moon Ceremony Hall had been built 2 centuries ago by a king who understood that architecture was a weapon. The ceiling rose 60 feet above the floor, supported by columns of black marble veined with silver that caught torchlight and threw it back in jagged lines, so that the room itself seemed to pulse with something alive and restless. The floor was white stone, polished to a mirror finish, and every footstep echoed twice, once from the impact and once from the walls, so that a single person walking sounded like two and a crowd sounded like an army. It was a room designed to make human beings feel small, to remind them that the empire was larger than any individual ambition and older than any living grievance. Tonight it was full, every seat occupied, every alcove claimed. Lords and ladies packed the tiered galleries in silk and velvet and fur, their faces lit from below by the ceremonial torches that lined the central aisle like vertebrae in a spine. The advisory council sat in their elevated box to the left of the throne dais, 15 men arranged in 3 rows, their expressions carefully neutral in the way that told Celine every one of them had already chosen a side and was simply waiting to see which way the wind settled before showing it. Celine stood in the preparation chamber behind the dais, alone. The door to the hall was closed. Through it, she could hear the low roar of 1,200 voices compressed into a space that amplified sound like a stone throat. Her gown was black. Not the crushed midnight of the banquet. True black. The black of ink. The black of a sky with no stars. It had no ornamentation, no jewels, no embroidery. It hung from her shoulders like a declaration, and the declaration was simple. She was not here to perform. She was not here to negotiate. She was here to end something. Her hair was down, loose past her shoulders, the way she had worn it in her chamber 3 nights ago when she pulled the pins and let the old version of herself fall to the floor with them. She had not pinned it since. The court would notice. The court would talk. Let them. She pressed her hand against the folded paper inside her gown, felt the edges of it against her skin, and breathed. Not the controlled, measured breathing she had used for years. Something deeper, slower. The breathing of a person who has accepted that the next hour will either save her or destroy her, and has stopped trying to calculate which. The door opened. Lord Commander Voss stepped through, armored, his face tight. "The hall is ready, Your Majesty." And Merelda, seated in the front gallery, Drake beside her. They arrived 20 minutes ago with an escort of 14. Armed? Ceremonial swords, nothing more. Celine looked at Voss. He was one of 4 people in the palace she had decided to trust absolutely over the past 3 days, not because she was certain of his loyalty, but because certainty was a luxury she could no longer afford, and Voss had the one quality that mattered more than allegiance. He was afraid of being on the wrong side. Men driven by fear were predictable, and predictable men were useful. "When I give the signal, seal the doors. No one enters, no one leaves. Your Majesty, if there is violence—" "There will not be violence, Voss. There will be consequences. They are different things." He nodded once, stiffly, and stepped aside. Celine walked through the door and into the hall. The sound hit her first. The collective intake of breath from 1,200 people who had expected the Empress to enter from the left, through the traditional processional arch, accompanied by heralds and attendants and the full ceremonial guard. Instead, she walked through the service entrance behind the dais, alone, unannounced, moving across the white stone floor with her black gown trailing behind her and her dark hair loose and her face carrying an expression that made the nearest courtiers physically lean back in their seats. Darius was already on the throne. He watched her approach, and whatever he was thinking was locked behind a face that had gone very still. She had not spoken to him since the night in his study. 3 days of silence between them. 3 days during which she had dismantled and rebuilt her entire strategy while he sat in council meetings and training yards and private chambers, carrying the weight of secrets he had kept too long and the knowledge that the woman he had tried to protect was now operating beyond his reach. She did not look at him as she took her position beside the throne. She could not afford to. Looking at Darius right now would cost her something she could not spare. The hall was watching, waiting. The ceremony had a traditional structure: opening invocations, renewal of oaths, recognition of noble houses. It was supposed to take 3 hours. Celine intended to dismantle it in 30 minutes. Merelda sat in the front row of the gallery, directly across from the throne dais, her crimson gown a wound against the neutral colors around her. Cassian Drake was on her right, his posture relaxed, his face wearing that half-smile Celine had catalogued and filed under threats that believe they are already victorious. On Merelda's left sat a woman Celine had not seen in 2 years, Celestine Ashworth, younger than Celine, softer, with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone who had been placed at the center of a conspiracy she did not fully understand and was too frightened to refuse. Celine looked at Celestine and felt something she had not expected. Not anger, something quieter. Recognition. She knew that look. She had worn it herself years ago, in a cold room in a house that was not hers, wearing clothes that did not fit, sitting at a table where her plate was always served last. The look of someone who has learned that survival means doing what powerful people tell you to do and hoping the cost does not kill you. She filed the feeling away. Not gone, just stored. She could afford compassion later, if there was a later. The hall settled. The ceremonial torches burned, and Merelda made her move. She stood. The motion was deliberate, timed to coincide with the traditional pause between the opening rites and the oath renewals, and every person in the hall understood that what followed was not part of the program. Lords and ladies of the Valamont Empire. Merelda's voice filled the hall the way water fills a crack, finding every gap, pressing into every space. I stand before you not as a petitioner, but as a mother who has watched in silence for 3 years while this empire's future was gambled on a union that has produced nothing. No heir, no alliance, no strength. I can be silent no longer. She turned to Celine. Empress, I asked you 14 days ago to step aside willingly. You demanded this hearing. You demanded evidence, witnesses, protocol. Very well. I have brought all 3. Cassian Drake rose and produced a leather case. From it he drew a sheaf of documents, medical assessments, physician statements, financial audits of the imperial household that painted a picture of waste and mismanagement so detailed it could only have been assembled with inside help. The physicians confirm the Empress is unable to bear children, Cassian said, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man reading charges he has rehearsed. The treasury records show a household budget exceeding that of the last 3 queens combined, with no corresponding diplomatic or economic benefit. And the Advisory Council, by a vote of 8-5 with 2 abstentions, has determined that the succession is in jeopardy and that the crown must act. He looked at Celine. We petition the throne to dissolve the imperial marriage and recognize Lady Celestine Ashworth as heir apparent, with Lady Merelda serving as regent until such time as Lord Commander Voss. Celine's voice cut through Cassian's like a blade through canvas. 2 words, spoken without raising her volume. The hall went silent so fast it felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. Voss moved. The doors at every entrance to the hall swung shut simultaneously, and the sound of iron bolts driving home echoed through the chamber like a sequence of gunshots. 1,200 people heard it. 1,200 people understood what it meant. No one leaves, Celine said. She stepped forward from the dais and descended the 3 stairs to the main floor, her black gown pooling on the white stone, and the contrast was so stark it looked like a shadow had detached itself from the throne and begun to move independently. Merelda's face shifted. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, a slight adjustment in posture. The instinctive recalibration of a predator that has just realized the terrain has changed. This is not your proceeding to control, Merelda said. It was never yours either. You simply arrived first. Celine turned to the Advisory Council box. Lord Aldrich Montague, you voted to elevate Celestine. On what date did Lord Cassian Drake visit your estate to discuss this vote? Montague's face drained. He looked at Merelda, looked at Drake, looked back at Celine. I do not see how that is. April the 9th. You met in your private library for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Drake offered you land grants from the Northern Territories, estates confiscated from border lords, territory that does not belong to any party present and cannot legally be offered outside the crown. Your steward documented the meeting in his personal ledger, which he keeps in a locked box beneath the floorboards of his quarters at the Broken Wheel Tavern. I have a copy. The silence in the hall was no longer silence. It was pressure, the kind that builds behind a dam before the stone gives way. Montague said nothing. His mouth worked, but nothing came out, and the nothing was louder than anything he could have said. Celine turned to the next face. Lord Harwood, you were approached on April the 14th. The same offer, different territory. You accepted and counteroffered with a request for a naval commission for your eldest son. Drake agreed. She moved to the next. Lord Pemberton, April the 22nd. Lady Stanton, April the 30th. Name by name, date by date. She moved through the council like a surgeon, precise and unhurried, laying open each deal with the dispassionate accuracy of someone reading from a record she knows is unimpeachable because she built it herself, line by line, over 3 months of work that no one in this room had believed her capable of. Cassian Drake's half-smile was gone. Completely gone. His face had gone flat, expressionless, the face of a man whose calculations are failing in real time and who is scrambling to find a new equation before the old one finishes collapsing. Merelda was harder to read. She had not moved, had not spoken. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her eyes tracked Celine with the fixed intensity of someone watching a fire approach and trying to determine whether it can be outrun. These are accusations, Merelda said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful now, a wall being held in place by will alone. Words spoken in a ceremony hall without legal standing. Then let me give them standing. Celine raised her hand. A side door opened, and Orrin Blackwell walked in carrying a wooden case. He was pale, trembling slightly, a man built for columns of numbers and quiet rooms who was now standing in front of the most powerful assembly in the Empire. But he walked straight, and he did not stop until he reached Celine's side. This is the Treasury clerk responsible for auditing the Empire's financial records. In this case are the original ledgers documenting every transaction I have described. Verified seals, dated entries, witness marks. I also have correspondence. She paused. Let the word land. Intercepted letters between Lord Cassian Drake and members of this council. Letters between Drake and Lady Merelda. And one letter in particular that I would like to read aloud, if the court will permit. She did not wait for permission. This letter was written by Cassian Drake. It outlines a schedule of specific dosages to be administered to a specific individual over a period of several months, designed to mimic natural illness and result in organ failure and death. The target is not named in the letter, but the physician who has been administering these dosages under the guise of treating headaches and fatigue is named, and he is currently being held in the palace garrison, where he confessed this morning. The hall detonated, not with sound, with movement, bodies shifting, heads turning, hands gripping armrests, 1,200 people simultaneously realizing that they were not watching a political dispute but a criminal trial, and that the doors were locked. Darius rose from the throne, slowly. The way a man rises when the ground he is standing on has just shifted and he is not yet sure what shape it will take when it settles. His face was white, not angry white, the white of a man hearing for the first time that someone has been killing him in inches for months, and that the person who knew it was the wife he had shut out, the wife he had lied to, the wife who had carried the weight of his murder in silence, because she understood that the timing of the truth mattered more than the truth itself. Celine, he said, just her name. But the way he said it was different from every time before. It was not a command, not a question. It was the sound of a man recognizing someone he thought he knew and realizing he had never seen them clearly until this moment. She did not look at him. Not yet. She was not finished. The poison, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall, was one conspiracy. The political corruption was another. But there is a third. She turned to face the full assembly. 6 months ago, representatives of 3 noble houses in this empire opened negotiations with the Caliph Confederacy. They offered territorial concessions in exchange for military support. The Confederacy has been positioning troops along our northern frontier for months. Their timeline for intervention is 2 months from tonight, and the trigger for that intervention is exactly what Lady Merelda has been engineering. A change of leadership, a weakened crown, an empire so consumed by internal conflict that it cannot defend its own borders. The hall was beyond silence now. It had entered a space where silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. Shock. The collective weight of 1,200 people understanding, all at once, that they are standing inside something that is falling. Merelda's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a collapse. It broke the way old wood breaks, with a sound you feel more than hear, a structural failure that begins at the center and works its way outward. Her hands unclasped, her chin dropped by 2 degrees, and her eyes, for the first time, showed something Celine had never seen in them. Fear. You have no proof of that, Merelda said, and the words came out faster than she intended, which was proof enough for anyone watching closely. I have the intercepted communications. I have the border commander's original intelligence report. I have the names of the houses involved and the terms they negotiated. And I have something else. Celine reached into the folds of her gown and produced a single sheet of paper. She held it up, and the torchlight caught it, and the hall leaned forward as though pulled by a single string. This letter was found in a chamber inside this palace 4 days ago. It contains 3 words: kill the Empress. She let the paper hang in the air, let every eye in the hall fix on it. Let the words soak into the silence like blood into white stone. I do not yet know who wrote it. I do not know who was meant to carry it out. But I know this. Someone in this room, tonight, accepted that order. Someone in this hall came here not to witness a ceremony or a trial, but to ensure that I do not leave this building alive. The hall erupted, not with words, with bodies. People rising, turning, guards reaching for weapons, the sudden chaotic motion of a crowd, realizing that the threat is not theoretical but present, physical, here, breathing the same air. And in the chaos, Celine saw it. A movement she almost missed. Cassian Drake, his face locked in the frozen calculation of a man whose every option has collapsed, reaching beneath his ceremonial coat. Not for a sword, for something smaller, something that fit in the hand. Celine's body understood before her mind did. Every survival instinct she had developed since childhood, since the cold room, since the empty plate, since the years of silence and stillness and waiting, fired at once. Not as thought, as motion. She stepped sideways, fast, her gown tangling around her feet, her hand catching the edge of the dais for balance. Darius moved. She did not see him move. She heard it. The crash of the throne toppling behind him, the thunder of his boots on the stone, the raw animal sound that came from his throat as he launched himself from the dais toward Drake with the full weight of a man who has just learned that the person who tried to kill his wife is standing 10 feet away and reaching for a weapon. But Drake was not reaching for Celine. His hand came up holding a glass vial no larger than his thumb, and in the split second before Darius reached him, he brought it to his own lips and bit down. Voss tackled Drake from the side. The vial shattered. Liquid ran down Drake's chin, mixing with blood from the glass cutting his mouth. He convulsed once, twice, and then his body went rigid and his eyes rolled upward, and the half-smile that had lived on his face for weeks finally disappeared into something blank and permanent. The hall screamed, a sound that came from everywhere at once, from 1,200 throats simultaneously processing the sight of a man dying on white stone in the middle of a ceremony that was supposed to be about oaths and tradition and the orderly transfer of power. And in that scream, in that moment of total chaos, Celine saw the second thing she almost missed. Thorn. The Lord Chancellor, not running toward the commotion like everyone else, running away from it, moving along the wall toward the sealed eastern door with the focused urgency of a man who knows exactly where he is going and needs to get there before anyone notices he is gone. She did not call out, did not signal Voss. She moved. Through the crowd, against the current of panicking bodies, her eyes locked on Thorn's retreating back, her bare feet silent on the stone, because somewhere in the chaos she had lost her shoes and did not care. She caught him at the eastern door. He was working the bolt with both hands, his fingers slick with sweat, and when he heard her behind him, he turned with a face she had never seen him wear. Not the gray, careful, sweating face of the Lord Chancellor. Something underneath it, something cornered and desperate and absolutely, unmistakably guilty. "Open that door," Celine said, "and I will have you killed where you stand." "Your Majesty, I can explain. The letter, kill the Empress. It was not from Merelda. It was not from Drake. It was from you." Thorn's mouth opened, closed, his back pressed flat against the iron door and his chest heaved with the shallow, rapid breathing of a man whose body has accepted what his mind is still trying to deny. "You played both sides," Celine said. "Fed me intelligence to keep me focused on Merelda while you built your own exit. If Merelda won, you survived as her chancellor. If I won, you survived as mine. But you needed a contingency for the scenario where both of us burned, and that contingency was my death. You do not understand the position I was in. I understand it perfectly. You were afraid, and your fear was more important to you than my life." Behind her, the hall was still in chaos. Guards were moving, voices were shouting. Drake's body lay on the white stone in a spreading pool of something dark. and Merelda was being restrained by two soldiers, while Celestine stood frozen in place with tears running silently down a face that had never been built for any of this. And Darius. Darius was standing in the center of the hall, blood on his hands from where he had grabbed Drake before the vial shattered, his crown gone, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the room with the wild, desperate focus of a man looking for one person, looking for her. He found her. Across the hall, at the eastern door, standing over Thorn, with her hair loose and her feet bare, and her black gown stained with something she could not identify. Their eyes met, and the distance between them collapsed into something that was not forgiveness and not reconciliation, but something rawer, something that did not have a name yet because it had only just been born in the wreckage of everything they had both broken. Celine held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she turned back to Thorn. "Lord Commander Voss," she called, and her voice cut through the chaos the way it always did, clean and cold and impossible to ignore. "Take the Lord Chancellor into custody. Charges of high treason and conspiracy to commit regicide." Voss materialized. Thorn was seized, and as they dragged him away from the door, his feet scraping the stone, his face collapsing into something old and small and finished, he said one thing. One sentence, spoken not to Celine but to the air, to the hall, to whatever remnant of his own dignity was still listening. "The Confederacy moves in 6 weeks, not 2 months. 6 weeks. And the person who gave them the signal is not in this hall." Celine's blood went cold. Not the metaphorical cold of surprise. Actual cold. A physical sensation that started at the base of her skull and radiated downward through her spine and into her hands, which went numb at the fingertips. 6 weeks. Not 2 months. The timeline had accelerated. Someone had given the order to move early, and that someone was not Merelda, not Drake, not Thorn, not anyone Celine had identified or neutralized or even suspected. She stood at the eastern door of the moon ceremony hall with bare feet on cold stone and the wreckage of 3 conspiracies scattered across the floor behind her, and she understood with the terrible clarity of a woman who has just won a battle and lost a war that the enemy she had been fighting was not the enemy. It was the distraction, the noise, the bright burning spectacle designed to keep her eyes on the stage while the real threat moved in the dark. And the real threat was 6 weeks away from ending everything. 6 weeks. The number lived in Celine's chest like a second pulse, counting down behind her ribs, while the moon ceremony hall still reeked of broken glass, and the chemical stink of whatever Cassian Drake had used to kill himself on white stone. She did not sleep that night. She stood in the war room on the 3rd floor of the Eastern Tower, a room that had not been used since Darius's father died, and she spread every map she owned across the table and stared at the northern frontier until the lines blurred and reformed and blurred again. The Caliph Confederacy. 40,000 soldiers, if the border commander's estimates were accurate. Professional, well-supplied, operating on a timeline that someone inside the Empire had accelerated by 2 weeks. 2 weeks that Celine no longer had. Thorn's confession had been extracted by Voss before dawn. Not through violence, through something worse, through the simple, devastating act of placing the Lord Chancellor in a stone cell and leaving him alone with the knowledge that every person he had betrayed now knew his name. Men like Thorn did not break under pressure. They broke under isolation, under the removal of the only thing that had ever given them power, which was proximity to other powerful people. He talked for 3 hours. The picture he painted was uglier than Celine had imagined, and she had imagined it quite ugly. The Confederacy's contact inside the Empire was not a single person. It was a network. 11 nobles, 4 military officers, and 2 members of the diplomatic corps, all recruited over the course of 18 months through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and the simple, ancient promise that when the old order falls, the people who helped push it will be rewarded with pieces of whatever rises from the wreckage. Thorn had not built the network. He had discovered it 6 months ago while auditing treasury flows for discrepancies that he initially assumed were Merelda's doing. When he realized the scope of what he had found, he had faced a choice: report it to the crown and risk being silenced by conspirators he could not yet identify, or position himself as a middleman, feeding information to both sides, ensuring his survival regardless of which faction prevailed. He had chosen survival, the way a drowning man chooses the nearest piece of wreckage without asking whether it will hold his weight. "The signal," Celine said. She was standing over Thorn's cell, looking down at a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. Who sent the signal to accelerate? Thorn's eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out. He looked up at her from the stone bench where he sat with his hands hanging between his knees. And in that look was something she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. Exhaustion. Not the physical kind. The exhaustion of carrying too many lies for too long, until the weight of them compresses everything inside you into something dense and small and barely functional. Lord Marin Hale, Thorn said. Why Stan Hale's brother, commander of the Eastern Garrison. He sent the signal the night of the banquet, the night Merelda made her entrance. The chaos was the cover. While every eye in the Empire was watching your stepmother call you Baron, Hale dispatched a rider to the Confederacy's forward camp with authorization to move the timeline. Marin Hale controls 1,200 soldiers at the Eastern Garrison. 1,300, he has been quietly supplementing his ranks with mercenaries for months, paid through the same channels the Confederacy uses. Then the Eastern Garrison is compromised. The Eastern Garrison is hostile. If the Confederacy crosses the northern frontier, Hale opens the Eastern Corridor simultaneously, a two-front assault. The capital falls within a week. Celine absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, without visible reaction. But inside the vault, where she kept the things that could break her, a new crack formed, wider than the others, and through it leaked something that tasted like the metallic edge of real fear. Not fear of death, fear of inadequacy. The possibility that she had spent months fighting the wrong war and now lacked the time, the resources, and the allies to fight the right one. She left Thorn in his cell and climbed the stairs to the war room where Darius was waiting. He looked different. The ceremony had stripped something from him, some layer of royal performance that had been calcifying for years, and what remained was rawer, leaner, closer to the man who had once been a soldier before he was forced to become a king. The hollows under his eyes were still there, the grayish skin, the thinness, the poison's residue, still working through a body that would take weeks to recover even now that the physician had been arrested and the dosages stopped. But his eyes were clear, focused, burning with something that Celine had not seen in them for a long time. Anger. Not the diffuse, impotent anger of a man who does not understand what is happening to him. The directed, purposeful anger of a man who finally does. 6 weeks, he said, possibly less. Thorn's intelligence is compromised. If Hale sent the signal 2 weeks ago, the Confederacy may already be mobilizing. My mercenary companies on the Eastern Corridor. 1,200 men against Hale's 1,300, with a 40,000-strong Confederacy army behind them. It is not enough. No, it is not. They stood on opposite sides of the map table, and the distance between them was more than physical. It was the accumulated weight of 8 months of silence, of secrets kept and trust broken, and decisions made alone in dark rooms by people who should have been making them together. Celine felt it the way you feel a wound that has been numbed for so long you have forgotten it is there until someone presses on it, and the pain returns all at once, fresh and staggering. I should have told you, Darius said, about the transfers, the mercenaries, the Confederacy, all of it. I should have told you the night I burned that letter. Yes. I was afraid you would think I was failing. You were failing. We both were. The difference is that I was failing at a conspiracy I could see, and you were failing at one you were trying to hide. He flinched, a small, involuntary contraction of the muscles around his eyes, the kind of flinch that comes not from the impact of an insult, but from the impact of a truth you have been running from. I do not know how to fix what I broke between us, he said, but I know we cannot fight a war while it stays broken. Celine looked at him across the maps, across the distance, across the wreckage of a marriage that had been under siege from so many directions that neither of them had noticed the walls coming down until they were standing in the rubble. You do not fix what is broken between us by saying you should have trusted me. You fix it by trusting me now, starting with the next words out of your mouth. Darius straightened, drew a breath, and then he did something Celine had never seen him do in 3 years of marriage. He laid his hands flat on the map table, palms down, fingers spread, and he looked at her not as a king addressing his queen, but as a man addressing the one person in the world he could not afford to lose. Tell me what to do, he said, and I will do it. The words landed in the space between them and changed its shape, not into warmth, not into reconciliation, into something more practical and more honest, a foundation. The first plank laid across a gap that would take months to bridge fully, but a plank nonetheless, and strong enough to bear the weight of what had to happen next. Celine placed her hands on the map, call back the border regiments. Every soldier within 3 days' ride of the capital. Strip the western garrisons to skeleton crews. We cannot hold every frontier, so we hold the one that matters. The western provinces will be exposed. The western provinces are not the target. The Confederacy wants the capital. Everything else is secondary. And Hale's eastern garrison? Hale expects his betrayal to be a surprise. It is not. We use that. Send a diplomatic envoy to the eastern garrison under the pretense of reinforcement coordination. Include the arrest warrants in the dispatch bag. When the envoy arrives, Hale is seized before he can signal his mercenaries. If the envoy fails, if Hale gets word, then we fight on two fronts with whatever we have, and we accept that some of us will not survive it. She said it plainly, without drama, without the careful hedging she would have used a month ago when she still believed that the right strategy could eliminate all risk. Risk could not be eliminated. It could only be managed, and management meant accepting the costs you could not avoid and choosing which ones you were willing to pay. Darius nodded. Not the automatic nod of a king agreeing with an advisor. A real nod. The nod of a man who has heard a hard truth and is choosing to act on it instead of arguing with it. They worked through the night, side by side at the map table, marking positions, calculating timelines, drafting orders that would reshape the Empire's military posture in a matter of days. Celine wrote the diplomatic dispatch to Hale herself, and the language she used was a masterwork of deception, every sentence calibrated to reassure a traitor that his treachery remained undetected while simultaneously positioning loyal forces within striking distance of his command. Dawn came. Then another dawn. The days compressed into a blur of strategy sessions, troop movements, and the grinding, exhausting work of preparing an empire for a war. Most of its citizens did not yet know was coming. On the fourth day, the envoy reached the eastern garrison. Celine received word by rider at sunset. Marin Hale had been arrested in his own command tent, still holding the cipher key he used to communicate with the Confederacy. His mercenaries, leaderless and unpaid, had scattered within hours. The eastern corridor was sealed. On the seventh day, the border regiments reached the capital. 4,000 soldiers, road-worn and confused, flooding into a city that was only beginning to understand the scale of what its Empress had uncovered. Celine stood on the palace wall and watched them file through the gates, column after column, and she felt something she had not felt in months. Not confidence, something more fragile, the faint, tentative belief that the thing she was building might actually hold. On the 12th day, the Caliph Confederacy's forward scouts were spotted by a patrol on the northern ridge. The invasion had begun. But it had begun against an empire that was no longer blind, no longer divided, no longer eating itself from the inside out. It had begun against an empire that was waiting for it. The war lasted 19 days. Celine did not fight in it. She was not a soldier and had never pretended to be. But she ran the logistics from the war room with the same meticulous precision she had used to build her intelligence network, ensuring supply lines held, reserves deployed at the right moments, and communications between the front and the capital flowed without interruption. Darius rode north on the third day with the bulk of the army, and for 16 days Celine governed alone, making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, with nothing but her judgment and the maps on the wall and the steady, grinding discipline that had carried her through every crisis since childhood. Darius returned on a gray afternoon with mud on his boots and a cut along his jaw that would scar. The Confederacy had been broken at the northern ridge, their supply lines severed by the same mercenary companies Darius had secretly purchased months ago, now repositioned to the northern corridor where they hit the enemy's flank with a precision that turned an even battle into a rout. The border was secure. The threat was ended. He found Celine in the war room. She was standing at the map table, moving markers with a hand that trembled slightly from 16 days of inadequate sleep, and when she heard his footsteps, she turned and looked at him, and the room went very quiet. I was thinner, harder. The poison's damage still visible in his face, but diminished now, overwritten by something else, by the particular weathering that comes from commanding men in a real fight where real people die, and the decisions you make in the dark determine who comes home and who does not. It is done, he said. I know. I had the dispatches an hour ago. Then why are you still standing here moving markers? She looked down at her hands on the map. At the markers she had been adjusting, tiny wooden pieces representing regiments and supply lines, and the abstract machinery of an empire she had kept running through sheer force of will, while its king fought a war she had made possible by uncovering the conspiracy that would have destroyed them both. "Because if I stop," she said, and her voice cracked for the first time in months, a hairline fracture in the surface that she had maintained through Merelda's accusations and Darius's silence and the poison and the betrayal and the war. "I will have to feel all of it, and I am not sure I know how to do that anymore." Darius crossed the room, not fast. Slowly, the way you approach something that has been holding itself together so tightly and for so long that any sudden movement might cause it to shatter. He stopped in front of her, close enough to touch, and he did not touch her. He waited. Because for the first time in their marriage, he understood that this was not his moment to act. It was his moment to be present and let her decide what happened next. Celine looked at him, at the cut on his jaw, at the mud on his boots, at the hands that had held a sword for 19 days and were now hanging at his sides, open, empty, offering nothing except their presence. She exhaled, long, slow, ragged. An exhale that carried 3 months of accumulated weight, of ledgers and letters and locked drawers and keys pressed against skin, and the constant, annihilating effort of being the strongest person in every room she entered, while the rooms kept getting darker and the threats kept multiplying, and the loneliness kept deepening until it became a kind of gravity that pulled everything inward and let nothing escape. She put her hand on his chest, felt his heartbeat. Steady, strong, faster than it should have been, because he was afraid too, afraid of this moment, afraid of what it would mean if she pulled away, and what it would mean if she did not. "I am tired, Darius. I know. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. I know that too." She closed her eyes. His hand came up and covered hers, and the warmth of it was so simple, so ordinary, so completely different from everything she had been holding, that something inside her finally unlocked. Not dramatically, not with sobs or collapse or any of the theatrical catharsis that stories pretend grief looks like. Just a quiet release, a loosening of something that had been clenched so long she had forgotten it could open. The coronation happened a week later, not the moon ceremony. A new ceremony, held in the grand hall of Ashenmere, stripped of the old traditions that had been corrupted and rebuilt with new ones. Celine had insisted on 2 changes. The first was that every person who had conspired against the crown would be named publicly, their crimes read aloud, their titles revoked in front of the empire they had tried to sell. Merelda stood in chains in the center of the hall, while her name was erased from the royal registry. She did not beg, she did not weep. She stood rigid and silent, and Celine respected that distantly, the way you respect the structural integrity of a building you are about to demolish. Merelda was exiled to the far provinces, her estates seized, her wealth returned to the treasury, and from there to the starving districts that had been bled dry by the corruption she had enabled. Celestine was spared. Celine had argued for it privately with Darius, and the argument had been brief. Celestine had been a weapon, not a wielder, a young woman placed at the center of a conspiracy by a mother who viewed her as a tool rather than a daughter. Celine knew something about being used by the people who were supposed to protect you. She knew what it cost and how long the repair took, and how the first step was always someone choosing mercy when the world expected punishment. Celestine was given a small estate in the southern provinces, and a letter, unsigned, that contained a single line: "You are not what they made you. Build something of your own." The second change Celine insisted on was the crowning itself. In the old tradition, the king crowned the queen. It was a gesture of conferral, of power granted from above, a ritual that encoded the assumption that a queen's authority was borrowed from her husband's. Celine refused it. She crowned herself. Lifted the circlet from the velvet cushion with her own hands, placed it on her own head, and turned to face the hall with her spine straight and her dark hair loose and her black gown pooling around her feet on the white stone floor. The court watched, and in their watching was something that had not been there before. Not love. Not yet. Something more durable than love. Recognition. The acknowledgement that the woman standing before them had earned her position, not through bloodline or marriage or political maneuvering, but through the simple, brutal fact of being the person who held the empire together when everyone else was trying to tear it apart. Darius did not crown himself afterward. He knelt. In full view of the court, the King Alpha of the Valamont Empire lowered himself to one knee before his wife. and the hall went silent with the particular quality of silence that accompanies the witnessing of something that will be remembered for generations. "I do not kneel because you are stronger than me," he said, and his voice carried to every corner. "I kneel because I was too proud to see what was in front of me, and pride nearly cost me everything." Celine looked down at him, at the man she had married, at the man who had failed her and lied to her and shut her out, and then, in the end, handed her his sword and his army and his trust and asked her to save them both. At the man kneeling on stone that was still stained, faintly, from the night Cassian Drake died on it. She extended her hand. He took it, rose, and stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, where he should have been standing all along. The hall erupted. Not in the desperate, fractured way it had erupted during the moon ceremony. In the slow building way of something genuine. Applause. Then voices. Then feet stamping on stone. The old imperial salute, the one reserved for leaders who had proven themselves in crisis. The sound filled the hall and spilled through the open doors into the courtyard, and from there into the streets of the capital, where thousands of citizens who had survived a near invasion and a near collapse heard the sound and understood, in the way that people always understand the sounds that come from the halls of power, that something fundamental had changed. That evening, after the ceremonies and the feasts, and the formal declarations that would reshape the empire's political landscape for decades, Celine returned to her chambers in the Eastern Tower. She sat at her desk, opened the drawer, removed the ledger, the poisoned letter, the intercepted correspondence, the treasury audits. All of it. The accumulated evidence of 3 months of work that had saved the throne and nearly destroyed her in the process. She looked at the pages for a long time. At her own handwriting, small and precise and compressed, the writing of a woman who had learned to make herself small because the world punished women who took up space. She ran her fingers over the entries, over the names and dates and amounts, over the record of a war she had fought in silence against enemies who had underestimated her because underestimating quiet women was the oldest and most reliable mistake in the history of power. Then she closed the ledger, locked the drawer, and removed the key from the chain around her neck. She held it in her palm for a moment. The metal was warm. It had been warm for weeks, heated by her skin, pressed against her chest through every crisis and confrontation and sleepless night. It had become so familiar that she had stopped noticing its weight. That was the danger. When you carry something long enough, it becomes part of you, and the things that become part of you are the hardest to let go of. The vigilance, the suspicion, the constant corrosive readiness for betrayal. These had kept her alive. They had also kept her alone, sealed inside a fortress of her own making, safe and unreachable and slowly suffocating. She set the key on the desk, left it there, stepped back. The woman who had needed that key, the woman who had trusted no one and relied on nothing and built her survival out of silence and patience and the grim mathematics of self-preservation, that woman had done her work. She had saved the empire. She had exposed the corruption. She had stopped a war. She had earned the crown she wore. But earning a crown and wearing one were different things. Earning required the hardness she had cultivated since childhood. Wearing required something she had almost forgotten how to access. The willingness to be seen. Not the curated, controlled visibility of a political performer. The real kind. The kind that meant allowing people close enough to disappoint you and choosing to remain open anyway, not because openness was safe, but because the alternative was a throne surrounded by walls so high that nothing could get in, including the things worth living for. Celine walked to the window, opened it. The night air of the capital poured in, carrying the sounds of a city that was still celebrating, still processing, still learning the name of the Empress who had saved it from a collapse it barely understood. She breathed the air in deep, let it fill her lungs, let it replace the stale atmosphere of locked rooms and sealed documents and whispered conspiracies. Below her tower, the palace gate stood open. Not a security risk, a statement. The gates that had closed behind Merelda and Drake and Thorne and every other traitor who had tried to bring the empire down from the inside were now open, and the light from the courtyard torches spilled through them into the street beyond, where it mixed with the light from 1,000 windows in a city that was, for the first time in months, not afraid of what tomorrow would bring. Celine stood at the window and let the wind move through her hair, and she did not pin it back.